So welcome to the second session of the Fashion Zero Agenda Policy Gaps Opportunity session. So this session will focus on better wage systems, and we have a great panel with us representing the different stakeholder groups that are all very, very important to drive forward improvements in the wage systems. Please remember to look on your right side of the screen where you will have both a chat box and a Q&A. So feel free to ask questions, have a dialogue going, or use the Q&A for questions, and we'll see if we can find time in the end for that as well. But first, I will give the word to our first speaker, who is Christiana Clausen, who is the Director of Textile and Garment Industry at IndustriALL Global Union. The floor is yours.
Thanks. It's lovely to be here with you all, albeit virtually. So this session is really looking at the challenges and opportunities around setting better wage systems. And I think for workers in the garment sector, it's quite clear that the wage setting mechanisms that are currently in place are quite problematic. So the way the wages right now, many is through minimum wage setting mechanisms, and if workers have trade unions in their individual factories, they might be able to negotiate higher wages. But that is still very far from a living wage. And I think in this session, I'd just like, from the IndustriALL's perspective, to talk a little bit about where we see some opportunities, because the challenges are great, but there are real opportunities. And I would say one of the main opportunities where IndustriALL has been focusing its policy work has been around our relationship in action, collaboration, and transformation. This is actually the first time in the history of the garment industry that international brands, retailers, global trade unions have set up a joint foundation with the objective to transform the industry and achieve living wages in the sector. But that's through collective bargaining. I think that's really an important component for us as trade unions, that we feel that collective bargaining is actually the way forward to really overcome some of the challenges, specifically the way the industry is currently organized. It limits the policy space for any country, any producer, or any buyer to ensure the necessary changes for better working conditions. So that's where we see that act, where we have country groups that are made up of brands, industries, and trade unions, local and global, are able to come together and look for new forms of collaboration. And I think that's where the point I wanted to emphasize is that change requires these new forms of collaborations between buyers, workers, and suppliers, because we need to find a way to overcome the constant competitive downward pressure on wages and working conditions. And that's where I think where we feel that the notion of sectoral bargaining takes wages out of competition, and that's a way to alleviate that downward pressure. But I think also another key component of the work that we do in ACT, and I'm going to actually let Rick talk to this, is about how you can link your purchasing practices as a brand to help overcome these challenges, because as we know that there are really key problems in purchasing practice, and I'm sure Miran will also, from the supplier's perspective, discuss this as well. So we really see that there's voluntary but binding solutions negotiated between the actors in the industry. These have the greatest potential to reflect the needs and the possibilities of the industry, and are more likely to be implemented and enforced in practice than any top-down solution. So I'm going to leave my comments here and let the others continue. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Christina. Great introduction and the importance of ACT and collective bargaining. But now over to Dorothy Lovell, and let's hear from the OECD. Dorothy is the policy advisor on textile and garment from the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct. over to you, Dorothy.
Many thanks, Morten. Can you hear me fine? Just checking you can hear me, Morten. Can you
Yes,
confirm?
yes.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so thanks so much for having me here today. Really interested and pleased to see the CEO agenda setting living wages as a priority for action. This is a prevalent sector risk, as was determined in the creation of the OECD due diligence guidance in this sector as many as 4 years ago now. It's good and important that it's recognized as a systemic issue that requires really a multifaceted action plan to address, from commitment, so policy and management systems, dialogue and the mechanisms to ensure that dialogue takes place, and then action, which will include a whole plethora of tools, monitoring systems, and ensuring transparency on this important issue. So just as it's important that commitments on wages include obviously thinking forward and setting vision and targets towards living wages, it's important to recognize that also within due diligence is the responsibility to address existing harms. And we know that in this sector, wages are a risk currently, and that companies have a responsibility to obviously understand how their own activities may be contributing to this issue, and this can include anything from purchasing practices, as we've heard, and also understanding exactly the relationship and perhaps even needing to contribute to some kind of remediation, which can be anything, of course, from using leverage with suppliers so that workers get paid, to potentially making financial contributions if that relationship is determined in coordination and discussion with key stakeholders. So 3 key points very quickly that would relate to a system-based approach to wages. So firstly, we've heard worker dialogue and right to join the union and bargain. Collective bargaining is really, you cannot decouple this from making a commitment on wages. So CEOs creating commitments on living wages will need to also commit to these rights. And you can see practical actions on how companies are already really addressing this. So we've heard about ACT, of course, but also the existence of global framework agreements between brands and global unions, which create kind of oversight for freedom of association issues at the site level. Secondly, purchasing practices. As mentioned, we know that brands' own purchasing practices have an effect on wages and the capacity of suppliers to pay correct wages. I won't speak too much more on that, since other panelists I'm sure will address. The third point I want to mention is to redress the power imbalance in the supply chain, and this has come up a lot in the last year, particularly around the COVID pandemic, and rightly so. We're seeing now manufacturers getting together, and I'm sure Miran will talk about this, to actually work on agreed payment terms that they would then negotiate and discuss with buyers around ensuring improvement on this point. We also have seen, and maybe many of you have seen, the American Bar Association put out recently model contract clauses, which include a buyer code of conduct, and this is a great step forward. So just then, I think we were also asked to briefly comment on EU mandatory due diligence. So I'll just finish with the final comment on this. So we expect that mandatory due diligence coming from the EU will establish expectations on due diligence across sectors. And we've heard already from the EU, and really pleased to know that they will, of course, look to align anything that they create with existing standards. And Andrew Martin in the previous session really talked to the importance of this. But of course, there'll be a need to complement with sector-specific and risk-specific considerations. And it's really, even though we don't know yet what this will look like, it's very likely that policymakers will look to existing collaborative action in the sector. So that's also another great reason for the CEOs to take up, as part of this agenda, collaborative action aligned with the OECD guidance. Thank you.
Thanks a lot of CEOs, since we are talking about the fashion. Yeah. And now over to Christian Smith from the Fairware Foundation, where he works on ESG, due diligence, and stakeholder engagement. Yours, Christian.
Thanks, Morten, and thanks all to the other panelists as well. Excuse me. So we know very clearly that the wages in the garment sector are all too low, and that the principal beneficiaries of these low wages are the brands, who are increasingly taking on the responsibility, whether independently or through the alignment with OECD due diligence guidelines, in order to improve the situation. Now, even though brands do not directly employ the workers, they can, through their personal practices and deeper relationships with factories, provide the adequate pricing to their goods that allow for wages to be paid. When we look at the way that Fairware operates, we have been operating much more from a brand by brand perspective, in helping brands to understand the labor costing methodology. We've developed a fair price calculator to help brands to ring fence labor costs, which is a way to understand what are the variable costs, what changes can we make outside of that in order to secure the right financing for the wages for the workers themselves. That is a complementary way to work with, for example, ACT, that's going into much more CBA sectoral way. And I think that when you put those things together, you can actually get a lot of really good movement based on the commitments that organizations are making. We really do see that the shared responsibility between the brands and the factories is really important. But what we also see is that legislation is taken as a kind of panacea. That once legislation is in, everything kind of sorts itself out, and people start doing things automatically. But what we have to be aware of is that legislation can't prevent gaps. Legislation has to also demonstrate that or indicate that all enterprises need to participate. And what we fear from a fair perspective is that maybe the SMEs are left behind, and that wouldn't actually resolve issues, because SMEs can contribute quite extensively to the fashion apparel and footwear industry. We also have to remember that the industry itself needs to benefit from legislation that provides good guidance. Legislation can be quite a blunt instrument, turning everything into a really binary yes or no type of thing. And it's really important that the legislation that's developed provides guidance, almost in the way that REACH for chemicals does, so that it's very clear to the different stakeholders what is required, what their role is, and how to implement their visions and collaborations moving forward. I'm going to leave it there for the moment. Hopefully we'll be giving you some time, Morten, and then we'll carry on with the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Christian, and great also with your input on that. Of course, the legislation is not the answer to all our questions, and the important role that SMEs are playing in the world for employment generation. We've heard a lot about ACT now, so now over to Rick Lambell, who is sitting in the member council at ACT, and then who is also head of sustainable development at the KMart group that covers KMart Australia and Target Australia. Over to you, Rick.
Thank you, Morten. Hi, everyone. So look, I guess in joining ACT as a brand, in partnership with IndustriALL, we believe really the best pathway to sustainable wage growth in the garment industry really is through freedom of association, industry collective bargaining, as Christina said. And the third element, of course, is the responsible purchasing practices of brands. And so I guess echoing what Christina said, partnerships are critical, with employers, the suppliers, brands, unions, and of course with government. And from our perspective in KMart Group, when we joined ACT about 5 years ago, before we joined, we did a global study, and we spoke to our brands around the world and suppliers, and got union and NGO perspectives as well. And really what we learned from that was that individual brand initiatives, factory by factory initiatives, were really not sustainable. Individually we don't have the scale to influence change that we need. And of course, competitive factors, undermining progress, both for brands and employers as well. So we really needed to look at this systematically and take an industry-wide approach, which is really what ACT does. So I want to talk a bit more about the purchasing practices aspects of the ACT approach. So, brands alone, we can't, increase wages. Of course, we don't own control factories ourselves. Yet we must recognize that we have a critical role to play, have an influence through our purchasing practices. And so we can either impede or facilitate progress to a living wage through our purchasing practices. So one of our key responsibilities as an ACT brand member is implementation of the ACT Global Purchasing Practices commitments, and those commitments were developed over 3 years through wide-ranging consultation and best practice, with the aim of really identifying the factors that would most support progress on wages in the long term. So those commitments, they cover five broad areas, and we've got KPIs and a lot of detail behind them. But a few of the key areas we focus on are ring fencing labour costs in price negotiations, improvements to our planning and forecasting, and fair terms of payment. And there are other ones, of course, but I won't go into further detail today. So those commitments, as ACT brands, we have committed that we will implement the total commitments no later than December 2023. I want to talk a bit about accountability for a minute. So I think one of the things that makes the ACT approach unique is the level of transparency and accountability. And that starts with the MOU we have with IndustriALL. So our CEOs have signed on at a company level. So it really is a business-wide commitment to be a member of ACT. Coming back to the purchasing practices themselves, so they're backed by a comprehensive accountability and monitoring framework. We do an annual supplier assessment of our purchasing practices, and we also submit data to the ACT Secretariat to verify our purchasing practices as well. And so from that, we get a comprehensive report for individual brands on how we're progressing. But of course, we're also going to produce an ACT-wide impact report, which is coming up shortly. So I guess the key point I wanted to make there is that ultimately our success with those purchasing practices will be judged by our suppliers and IndustriALL, not the brands themselves, which I think is important. And there's grievance mechanisms built into the monitoring and engagement framework as well, which can be used. So we've got a long road ahead, and we obviously realise we've got many improvements to make as brands, but we have had some great progress. And I guess one of the things I wanted to mention briefly is the supplier and brand self-assessment that we've just done. We've had over 5,000 responses, which we believe is the biggest purchasing practice assessment that's been done in the industry today. So we'll use that results now to identify gaps for improvement, year-on-year targets as we build up to that December 2023 commitment. Closing thoughts, I think, we want more brands to join ACT. We think it's really important. The partnerships is the right approach on this topic. We joined ACT as a voluntary initiative, but I think there is definitely a role for legislation to encourage more brands down the path of responsible purchasing practices. And I might stop there, but I'll come back with perhaps some more specific comments on areas of policy when we get into the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rick. And last, but definitely not least, Miran Ali, who's the Vice President of BGMEA and also a strong spokesperson for the manufacturer network. Miran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Morten. And yeah, so I'll be talking with 3 hats: supplier to most of the ACT brands, BGMEA, as well as a spokesperson. And I'm going to be fluctuating between all of those. The problem is, it's not that wages are being squeezed downwards. In most of the markets, in all the countries that we work with within the STAR network, including Bangladesh, wages are actually edging upwards. That's not the problem. The problem is that something Dorothy mentioned. It's the capacity to pay wages. Because if your actions push us as manufacturers to the brink of bankruptcy, that affects our ability to pay wages. And the climactic moment of this really was right around this time last year, when the COVID pandemic was really, taking its worst. And at that time, we really saw a vast range of difference in reactions within the brands across the spectrum, not just across the spectrum, also within the Act signatories, we saw a whole range of different reactions, different actions, and fair and unfair behavior, which resulted directly in our forming the network that we have, the STAR network with the International Apparel Federation, to try and have a platform where we as manufacturing associations have a means of speaking to our buyers, to have dialogue on a regional level rather than on an industry association or on a country level. Now, the principles on which ACT are founded are ones that we at the BGMEA are fully in support of. Yeah, it is absolutely within the buying practices of our purchasers to really determine not just the wages, the very survivability of our factories. And there is a massive power imbalance here, because if one of my big customers comes and demands something, whether it's fair or unfair or planned or unplanned, I'm going to have to try and accommodate it. In failing to accommodate it, that jeopardizes my ability to pay my wages. It's not that I'm going to cut my workers' wages because of something that Rick has done, but it would be something that affects my ability to continue to pay. That, I think, is the biggest risk that we have for the workers in our industry, is the risk on their livelihood. And in the case of Bangladesh, the government actually stepped forward and gave low-cost loans to garments factory owners to facilitate payment of wages when $3.2 billion worth of orders were canceled in Bangladesh. Of course, there were very notable exceptions to this. Many companies stood by us throughout this, both ones which are signatories to ACT and ones which are not signatories to ACT. But the point is that that was really a watershed moment, and we realized that we need to change the way we have dialogue. In terms of improving workers' wages, that is something that both as a manufacturer and as a representative of the BGMEA is something that we are fully in support of. Bangladesh has signed most of the ILO conventions. We guarantee the freedom of association. The elected workers' participation committees are mandatory in Bangladesh. Yes, before Christina jumps on it, it's not fully exercised yet. There's still a ways to go, but we are working towards it. Dialogue, social dialogue is something that we are completely dedicated to. And this is, in my personal case, we have seen that it helps. But ultimately, my buyer is the one who determines what's going to happen to me. And legislation, I'm sorry, that's I agree with Christian there. That's no panacea. Legislation is just going to add another layer of compliance. It's going to create some jobs in the West among our buyers in their head offices, and it's going to add to my overhead, and that's about it. I don't see that happening. I don't see that moving anywhere. ACT, I want to move with ACT. I want to work on ACT, but I want to work with ACT on a regional level, not just on a country level, but really to push ACT across all the countries that it is meant to encompass, including all of the STAR network as well. We need to really push that forward. Thank you, Morten.
Thanks a lot. And maybe before we head over to my one and only question for you is, any comments on the different aspects that you've heard here?
The question?
To all of you, to what? Yeah. Then I
had a question for Christian. Christian, I was interested in your wage calculator tools. I was having a look, actually. I was just interested in the uptake of using those tools amongst brands, and how do you measure the impact of those tools?
The tools haven't been around for that long, and we're currently piloting them, working with them internally with our member brands. One of the things we've been working on recently is turning it into a desktop application and making that desktop application available to everyone who wants to use it. And so through that, we'll be able to monitor much closer what uptake is, and also be a lot more aware of what the impact has been as well on the supply chain. The one limitation that we do have at the moment is that Fairware only operates in 11 different countries. And so the tool is available for those 11 countries, but nowhere else. That does not mean, and we would welcome working to expand the tool so that we can cover other countries that do not fall within the Fairware focus areas.
Cool. But maybe then a question from me to all of you. Even though you've said, a few of you, that legislation is not the panacea and not the solution to all of it, what should policymakers then be focusing on? What is the key things that they can do to really accelerate the pace of sustainability in our industry? Maybe starting with you, Rick.
Yeah, so I think approach this from the purchasing practices again. So I think there is a role for legislation on due diligence, because, you know, I think the challenge for CEOs is they're juggling with so many priorities in the field of sustainable development. Even there's so many topics, you know, we could be focused on. And if I look at one like modern slavery the last few years, which has, you know, been, you know, a very important topic, and it's received a lot of attention in my country, but other countries like the UK will have modern slavery legislation as well. So I think the legislation like that can help to shine a light and focus the attention of, you know, company CEOs, and certainly in the area of responsible purchasing, I think, you know, we'd like to encourage more brands on the journey to take this topic seriously. It's not a panacea, as others have mentioned. You have to be committed to change as brands and work in partnership with others, but I think it can help.
Thanks a lot. Miran, the skeptic on the role of policymakers, what is it they can do if you are to be optimistic about their role?
I am an optimist. I'm not a skeptic. Policymakers need to demand transparency. Transparency, shining the light on the dark crevices of sourcing strategies, is what cleans everything up. That is the real disinfectant. I really sincerely believe that if all the ACT signatories had to be completely transparent, sorry to pick on ACT, but if all buyers had to be transparent about their supply chains, like a lot of brands are, that really would make a fundamental difference. Let's see how much you buy direct. Let's see how much you go through agents. Let's see let the purchasing, the sourcing be transparent. There's no secret. H&M, Nike, Adidas, they all have it all on the website. So what's the secret? Just put it out.
Transparency, great. Maybe over to you, Christian Smith, from your point of view. What is it that they should be doing, these policymakers?
Yeah, I kind of second Miran on the transparency piece, forcing companies to be a lot more open about where they're sourcing from. But I think what legislation can also do is to raise the floor. There are far too many organizations, brands out there that are doing nothing and kind of riding on the coattails of others, which makes it incredibly difficult for those that do want to make an impact to move in a speedy way. And when you start to take into account the complexity of the fashion supply chain, you know, the number of brands that may be sourcing from a factory, it's really difficult for one brand to go into a factory and do something unless it's got, you know, 80-90% leverage. And so just raising the floor, pushing companies to the table that really have not wanted to engage, I think it's something that legislation can encourage, and then we can kind of go from there.
Cool. Dorothy, what's your take on the role of policymakers?
Thank you. Trying to find the unmute button. So, I mean, there's no one policy driver and action that policymakers can take, clearly. But one thing would be engaging with producing countries, governments. So there needs to be obviously a concerted effort from producing countries to industrialize, to incorporate kind of value add in their planning, and over time drive up wage levels through kind of skill development, etc., including labor enforcement and wage enforcement. But noting that might be a slightly longer term agenda, it's really important, and I think I would echo what Rick said, that it's really important that global purchasing practices do not undermine these efforts in producing countries. And so making sure that mandatory due diligence includes oversight of purchasing practices would be one really great step forward. And I think it's something that we would be very excited to see, having, you know, included purchasing practices as a key aspect of the OECD due diligence guidance. Thank you.
Amazing, thanks a lot. And Christina, you.
Maybe, you know, I believe that there's definitely room for legislation, and it's sort of building on what Christian and Rick brought out about the importance of not having free riders, right? If there's brands out there that are trying to move the needle and engage responsibly, and then you have the other side of the set, half the other brands, you know, just waiting in the sidelines and not moving forward on this, or committing to work in a collaborative way with their suppliers and with trade unions to make an industry shift. Because the question is it a systemic problem? And, you know, the other speakers have talked about how one brand can't do it alone. If there's a real change in this industry, it would be that part of the mandatory due diligence. But then just very briefly, I would say for production countries, what's key is around their labor legislation. So in some countries, sectoral bargaining is not a possibility. So if we do want to, there's policy changes that can happen on a national level as well. And I hope to, I like Miran's suggestion on moving this, you know, within that STAR network of suppliers and the manufacturing base that they're covering, to think about this. But that, I think, is, you know, a good step. That would be a good step forward in this sector, to really look at it that way. So I thank Miran for his suggestion, and I will take you up on that.
Thanks a lot, Christina. So there is a question here from David Hackfield, who speaks about that ACT's theory of change is good, but how about the practice? ACT is now there for 3 years or longer, but so far delivered little. What are the stumbling stones, and when can we expect to see real wage increases? Feel free to.
I can kind of maybe answer that one. So I think the foundation of ACT is quite important, and that there's a political and will from the brands to say sectoral bargaining is the way forward. But there's been some key building block pieces, I would say, that we've worked on in ACT. So one is the issue that I just highlighted before about if you don't have all the brands on, it's very hard to make a sectoral change, right? Because manufacturers are going to say, well, what's in it for me if only half the brands that I source from are doing this, right? So why would I engage in sectoral bargaining when I'm not getting these purchasing practice commitments from 50% of my customers? So I think that's a real challenge that ACT has faced. And I'm pleased to see the formation of the manufacturers organizing themselves around that. But there have been some very key important things that are, I would say, are building blocks to the structural foundation of collective bargaining, and that would be dispute resolution mechanisms and freedom of association guidelines, which we've been working on in different countries that have been priority countries for ACT. So I would say that those are key building blocks, and I think they lay a strong foundation, because what's really missing here is a structural foundation.
Thanks a lot, all of you. We've now come to an end. Really, really great inputs from all of you, showing both how complex it is, but also seeing the alignment on some of those key building blocks on purchasing practices, collective bargaining, the role that ACT can play, and what policymakers should do and should not do. They should not only create jobs in the West, of course, but what their role could be. So thank you very much. The session is now over, but please feel free to jump over to the next session on circular systems that will be starting 10 minutes from now. And for those of you who want to stay on and ask some questions in the Q&A or in the chat, please feel free to also do that. Thanks a lot, all of you.